Billy's grandma's house, that housed 2 families, and Heidi, if she ever returned. But she never returned, and Billy's dad died, and my brother still sleepwalked, and I still saw ghosts. In the spring, Mom told me they found Heidi. Dad was the one to find her. She'd frozen in the snow in a field just behind our house, and remained buried there until the snow thawed out. Dad scooped up her little white body and carried her to our home. When Jamie arrived, Dad placed Heidi in his arms like a baby. Jamie didn't look so tough anymore. Billy was standing behind him crying, and I wanted to give him the hug he had never gotten from his dad, but I couldn't. I didn't know how. Mom came up behind me and placed her hand on my shoulder gently and gave it a little squeeze. Everyone was silent but Jamie, who just said a quiet, fuck. Mom didn't even tell him to watch his language. She couldn't do anything for him or for Billy. His dad would never be back, and neither would Heidi. Dad reached out and squeezed Jamie's shoulder. It was one of those kinds of squeezes that men do, as if they're trying to say something without saying it. Heidi lay in Jamie's arms like an offering, but to what, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Our next presenter is Jessi Kalvitis. Jessi is from the Potomac, West Virginia. Eastern West Virginia, but is settled in Morgantown. Her writing focuses on rural childhood, estrangement of family, and issues of socioeconomic class.
Yay!
I don't really have an introduction for my piece, except that Rebecca and I kind of wrote ours in tandem. We both ended up having pieces that were about us as 8-year-olds, which, be afraid, be very afraid. In the long, slow afternoons of early spring, when sunset leaked turquoise through the leafless trees, then silvery pearl, then finally cobalt blue, I walked. I wasn't going anywhere in particular, only as far as I could get and still make it back for dinner. Light poured thick and clear, coming in at an angle to bring every fallen leaf, every broken branch and fleck of lichen into crisp shadowed focus. I was 8 or 9 then, a tall child with gangly limbs and straight blonde hair. I had worn glasses for less than a year, going from a hazy blur beyond about 3 feet away, to a sudden deluge of visual information about a world so beautiful it nearly knocked me over. I was still reeling from the change. I was also, despite my mother's growing attachment to an authoritarian religion, utterly unsupervised. She may have thought me safe from sin as long as I was the only human for miles around. More likely, she was busy enough with a preschooler, an infant, and the practical rigors of near-wilderness living, and figured that any day I survived with limbs intact and blood inside was a success. This sink-or-swim parenting philosophy suited me well. The road along the base of George's Knob, where it diverged from the single-lane pavement, started out as a narrow gravel track between cow pastures and forest. A sharp turn to the right took it through a marshy area where skunk cabbage unfurled speckled leaves, and thousands of tiny frogs cheeped at night. Next came another turn, left this time, and a few lazy up-and-down dips on the straightaway, past more cow pastures, past a few widely spaced houses. I could count them on one hand with fingers to spare. The unpainted farmhouse where Toad LaFollette lived alone, the low brick home of the O'Brien family, and the garbled junkyard of Art Brookfield. Art had large dogs who ran free, and a hand-dug koi pond, carved from the yellow-orange clay and shale, full of oversized fish with bulbous faces, eyes pushed far to the side. After Brookfield's rusted school buses, dented trucks, and skeletal tractors, the road sloped upward, and ran between tall trees for as far as I ever walked, passing a few summer homes and hunting camps before dead-ending somewhere miles away, where it tapered back into the deer path it had been before some long-ago developer graded it nearly smooth, and wide enough for 1 car to pass, 2 if they were slow and careful. After the cedars and locusts and dogwoods grew thick, but before the base road tapered away, there was a cleared spot to the right, cut into the grassy clay and roughly marked by 3 small boulders. An even narrower dirt road led uphill from there, deeply rutted by rain that lunged uninhibited down the slope, ricocheted from firmly planted chunks of sandstone, then veered to carve sharp paths like dendrites, like fractals, like the roots of trees. A little less than a mile up this road, near the crest of the highest point in Hampshire County, West Virginia, was my family's property, 7.5 steep wooded acres. In the lexicon of our shared history, we called it only the Knob. It came late in the list of my childhood homes, second to the last. We lived there before the trailer by the river, but long after the house on the plains of Iowa. Our family retreated to the Knob in August of 1985. We'd owned the property for about a year by then. My mother had been part of the Back to the Land movement in the early 1970s, the would-be Thoreaus who trailed along behind the hippies, with slightly more practical goals and fewer drugs. My father, scruffy and bearded like the father in the Little House books, was known by then as Pa to his family and most of our friends. He had been a supervisor for the crews of migrant workers in an apple orchard on the other end of the county. The house where we had lived, miles beyond the orchard and behind 2 locked gates, was part of his compensation for the job. He got fired. We moved. My middle sister, Leah, was 3 years old. Emily, the youngest, was 7 weeks. The road continued another mile or so uphill of our property, curving through the woods to meet up with even less used logging roads and hunting trails. The Knob itself sprawled across what seemed the world to me, thousands of acres, undisturbed. I spent every hour I could there, every moment when there was daylight and I wasn't in school. I scrambled from the ground to the top of giant rocks and back again as I made my way up the steep bank, balancing without a moment's thought, swinging around tree trunks and low-hanging limbs to propel myself forward. My thin, dirty canvas tennis shoes slid a little in the cold mud under layers of leaves, but my feet knew when to dig in and when to leap. As I pushed my way uphill, my movement stirred up a scent that could only ever come from a healthy forest of precisely this region, not too far north nor too far east, heavy on the hardwoods, but unlogged for a generation. It changed from season to season, I knew from other rambles, but the base of it was the same. It came from the cool stone, the hollows between boulders full of moss and lichen, from 4 distinct types of acorns in every state of decay, from fresh to wormy to dust, from mud comprised of mostly clay, a little disintegrating sandstone, and a great dark quantity of rotted leaves. Within these deep aromas were lighter ones, of the green things that grew under cover of the trees, crushed in passing between my ankles and a rock, ground underfoot or caught in my hair. Citronella and sassafras, rhododendron, teaberry, low and flat with shiny red berries, and waxy leaves that tasted like chewing gum. Brambles of wild blackberry, wild rose. A mile or so up the hill, I decided to head east along the slope and stop at my favorite boulder before reversing course and starting downhill. The boulder was the size of a minivan, a mass of gray, cold, perpetually damp stone jutting from the hillside. When I climbed to the top, my head was even with a spot about halfway up the tallest nearby trees. From there I could reach a thick grapevine. In late summer and early fall, these vines, scattered throughout the forest, produced clusters of small, dark, seedy fruit that had a musty, bitter, delicious flavor. Year-round, the vine served my sister Leah and me as a mode of transportation and entertainment, taking us from spots uphill to far downhill in one delightful Tarzan-like hurtling leap. I wrapped my hands around the vine as high up as I could reach and held on tight. The dry, rough bark scraped my palms, but they didn't slip. I flung myself out over space, into the emptiness between tree trunks and the thin, dark scrollwork of branches above. I experienced 10, then 20 feet of rapid weightlessness, with the cool, moist air rushing past my face as I held myself up into a hunched monkey shape. Then the vine reached the end of its arc. Quickly, before it began to swing back, I gave an extra flip of effort and flung myself into the air in front of me. I flew a few feet farther and landed as I always did, arms out for balance, knees bent, muscles slightly loose to make of me a person-sized spring that absorbed the energy of the drop. A second after I landed, I was upright again, trotting downhill through the web of tree shadows, undergrowth, and decades' worth of fallen limbs and trunks, all slowly rotting back into the soil. Half a mile or so from the giant boulder, with another 2 miles between myself and home, the constant soft background noise of shifting branches, wind and evergreens, and the first wave of spring songbirds was broken. My mom's whistle, not an item like the ones used by referees, but a skill involving 2 fingers pinched into her mouth, something she tried repeatedly to teach me, but from which I only ever drew wet splutters. To be heard all along the knob and throughout the valley it edged, farther if the leaves were down and the air was still. It meant, come home. And often, dinner's almost ready, or your father's upset by something you did and would like to discuss it with you. I never knew for sure which shade of meaning it embraced at any given time, but I knew it was never a good idea to delay. I picked up my pace, bending low to the ground to leapfrog over rocks and tree stumps, using feet and hands equally, scuttling and ducking through paths I knew by heart, but which were invisible to anyone else. A tangle of small branches with sharp thorns would catch my hair and tear my cheek if I didn't bend to the left and immediately turn back to the right to avoid an outcropping of weathered mossy limestone taller than my shoulder, close enough to another slab of rock that I had to turn sideways for 10 feet if I didn't want to get stuck. I'd done that once, wriggling free, but scraping a long swath of skin from my ribcage. Other times I climbed over the rock, using a nearby dogwood tree to get started, but that took longer. When Mom whistled, efficiency became more important than taking the scenic or the fun route. I was in view of the house when Mom whistled again. I could see her standing on the steps by the kitchen door, a thin woman in her early 30s, with curly brown hair and large plastic-rimmed glasses like mine, my youngest sister tucked against her hip. She couldn't see me, I knew. As the hill behind the house sloped up to meet the remnants of a logging road at a flat area that my father used as parking for his truck when the lower, smoother driveway became too muddy, the trees overlapped from the downhill perspective, forming a nearly solid backdrop of bark and rocks and fallen leaves. I was invisible there, moving quietly from habit, from an awed, hushed respect that spending hours each day in the woods had impressed upon me. Behind Mom and my sister, the exterior walls stood out sharply from the tan and gray of late winter. We'd been putting up lengths of T111 since we moved in, a packed fiberboard material that, unlike drywall, was light enough to easily lift and nail to the walls supporting 2x6s, a one-person job if the person could reach nearly to the top of the wall, a two-person job if one of the people was me. The outside of the fiberboard was slightly waterproof, marked with materials, information, and instruction in white paint on black. We'd gradually enclosed the lower floor of the house during the first winter we had lived there, adding rolled fiberglass insulation and an inside layer of fiberboard paneling where we could, as we found a little time here and there and a few more dollars for supplies. The roof was made of corrugated tin, hoisted and affixed by my father before we started the walls. The skeleton of a large front porch extended beyond the kitchen, with heavy planks balanced across thick posts 20 feet from the ground, where the hill dropped away toward the garden. Next to the kitchen was a room that housed my parents' bed and the wood stove that kept the house heated. Above that was a small sleeping loft for me and my sisters. I peeled my muddy shoes off as I reached the kitchen steps and tucked them under the edge of the house, where I could retrieve them in the morning before school. Barefoot, I clambered up the steps and into the kitchen, where the steamy warmth prickled my numb skin and made me realize how cold it had been out in the woods. Mom placed Emily in her high chair and finished rolling biscuit dough. As she cut the biscuits and put them in the oven, I slid over close to the other side of the room and watched through the door to the porch as the last pale peach-colored light faded out of the sky, and turned to the utter darkness that comes with a cloudy night in the forest, 15 miles and several valleys away from the nearest town. When I look back now, nearly a quarter of a century later, I have a hard time knowing which pair of eyes to use. From my own perspective in that moment, I was living something near normalcy, perhaps a hair better because I had an endless forest in my backyard, which few of my friends at school had, even in a moderately rural county 25 years ago. If I try to see it from my mother's point of view, I'm astonished at how backbreaking, how stressful it had to have been to keep up with the basic household necessities, with 3 small children and no modern conveniences. When I let my mindset shift to that of an outsider, I find myself protesting, making excuses for things I never considered at the time, things I'm not sure need now or ever needed to be excused. Had I, the 9-year-old with leaves in her hair and mud in her toes, had a bath that day? The day before? I don't know. There was no water source on the knob, so we hauled all our water from a spring a few miles away on the main road, in 5-gallon buckets in the back of the truck, and we heated it on the wood stove. Sometimes we used captured rainwater to supplement that, but it still had to be hauled into the house and heated, then poured into a large metal wash tub that was big enough for the infant, Emily, and perhaps for Leah as a toddler, but not even then for my long limbs. Once my mother had taken a pot of water off the stove after it boiled, then turned to fill the next. I rose from where I was sitting near the window with a book and managed to trip directly into the pot, immersing my right leg from below the knee to 6 inches above. As I screamed in pain and extricated myself, the skin was already starting to turn bright pink. When Mom got me across the room and into a bucket of cool water, it was blistering. By the next morning, the skin was sliding off in rubbery gray patches, leaving a slimy layer of pink and pale yellow ooze exposed beneath. I went to school with my knees swaddled in layers of bandages and aloe, grudgingly wearing one of the few skirts I owned so that my pants wouldn't stick to the burn. or rub it and keep it from healing. In my first class of the day, my teacher took one look at it and, hearing my story of how it had happened, sent me to the office. There, the school nurse, not a real nurse, but a gym teacher with a first aid kit, decided to remove the home-wrapped bandages, examine the damage, and rewrap it herself. I felt a sick, uncomfortable queasiness, not at the injury or the sight of blood or other fluids filming the surface of the churned pink flesh, but at the invasive sensation of her strong fingers, smooth and clean, with pink polished nails and delicate silver rings, holding my leg firmly in place, stripping away the layers and leaving my flesh naked to the air. I felt embarrassed, ashamed, and I didn't know why. The gym teacher rewrapped my knee without using a layer of petroleum jelly beneath the bandages, and nobody thought to check. As my skin healed, it grew around the fibers of the bandage fabric. A few weeks later, I had to have the entire area soaked in warm water until the healing scab softened up a little, and then the entire bandage was ripped off, taking the scab with it, and leaving me in precisely the same naked, oozing, skinless state in which I had begun the day immediately after the accident had happened. For the entire duration of healing, twice, I wore the same two ugly blue clad knee-length skirts. I can't remember the pain of skin sliding away from moist flesh, or of ripping layers of caked yellow scab and scraggly bandage from my leg, but I've never forgotten my hatred of those skirts. The gym teacher's strong, pretty, somehow dismissive fingers, and those ugly skirts. I remember knowing, but not how I found out, that there had been talk of calling in a social worker after that incident, not to educate the gym teacher in proper burn care, but to investigate my parents because it happened at all. I remember having to explain to teachers, the principal, the gym teacher, and a few more adults I couldn't identify that, yes, it had been an accident, of course it had been an accident. I'd turned and fallen, and sure, it hurt, but it was just the way life was. This sort of thing happened, didn't it? People fell out of trees, they dropped large rocks that hit their ankles. Sometimes they missed the nail and got their hands instead, didn't they? I sensed a disconnect between my world and the world of those questioning me, but I assigned all the strangeness to them. Did they live in bubbles, somehow protected from reality? Had they been inordinately fortunate in their lives to never encounter the baseline level of risk that day-to-day activity brought? To avoid trucks that slipped out of gear and hunting rifles mishandled, snakes and mad dogs, and sometimes rabid raccoons? These were things the world brought at intervals you could not predict or avoid. You dealt with them and got on with things. How was it that they didn't understand? I'm not, even now, entirely certain I was wrong. I must have answered their questions correctly, and failed to volunteer any information that raised red flags. There was no more mention of social workers, and eventually my knee healed up enough that I could set the hated skirts aside again for Sunday church and Tuesday Bible study, and change back into jeans. I could scramble over trees and rocks without fear of tearing off a layer of scab. I had a slick, pale scar over my entire knee for a few years, then some patches where the skin was thicker than normal and wouldn't take a suntan. Then, finally, not even that. I can look back, as much as I hate it, with split vision. Part of me sees exactly how it all must have looked to anybody outside of our family. Pa, always between jobs or working for cash under the table, always with a beer in his hand and thickly muscled arms ready to tense in anger, in frustration, at any moment. Mom at the grocery store with 3 unavoidably grubby children. But aren't all children usually? The ability of toddlers to find and embrace dirt transcends the presence or absence of running water. Mom tearing out the brightly colored paper sheets that were food stamps before the system switched to a debit card, stacking them on the counter and picking pennies out of the bottom of her wallet, and still sometimes having to ask the cashier to ring off the milk or put the bread away. Me, and later Leah, wandering for miles and miles in our own patch of wilderness, relying on woodcraft and good fortune to keep us from falling into a gully, or out of a tree, and laying broken in the soft rotting leaves to die before we were found, another decaying part of the ecosystem, weeks or months later. Part of me, though, sees that no matter what bothered me then, mean kids at school, Pa's rages, Mom snapping at us when she reached her limit, the sneaking suspicion that I was somehow inherently different and would never entirely fit into the outside world. I could go to my giant boulder, or to the deer paths that led past the hickory trees, and the spots where morels grew for a week in the spring, or I could climb halfway up my favorite dogwood tree and stretch my legs out on the widest limb while I read a book all afternoon. There, nothing mattered or ever would. There, then, my world was perfect, suspended in time. I have returned to the knob a few times in the decades since we moved away. My family went back every summer at first, to pick wineberries from the fuzzy red bushes that lined the bottom road for miles. After we stopped, my mother and sisters and I went a few times to hike the road up the hill, beyond the house and past the hickories, with friends or alone, to enjoy the silence and the beauty of the place. I went back alone twice after that, walking tense-legged down the trail from the parking space. Still silent after all these years, but never as comfortable as I had been. A new nervousness prickling the back of my neck, a sense that I am the only thing that is out of place. The house and land have been sold as a hunting camp, and I suspect that eventually even the hunters have abandoned it, in favor of guided excursions and more luxurious accommodations in the southern part of the state. The road has become hopelessly rutted, impassable to even the tallest and toughest of four-wheel drive vehicles. The driveway is overgrown with brambles. The outhouse door hangs on one metal hinge, clunking heavily against the wall when the wind moves it. There are holes in the kitchen floor, and some animal, a raccoon, I know without intending to know it, has taken an enormous shit on one of the remaining squares of linoleum. Even the shit is old-weathered, beginning to yield to the rain that has been blowing for years through the broken door and the leaking roof. The ladder to the sleeping loft is intact, built of leftover oak 2x4s, the rungs worn smooth by my sister's feet, by mine, by my mother's, over many nights and mornings. I crawl across the floor to what was the space between my bed, a mattress on the floor, and Leah's. Emily slept on a smaller mattress beyond my feet, closer to the railing that kept us from falling through the gap by the ladder onto the wood stove below. I'm troubled by how low the ceiling is, how small the windows in the space. I've grown a foot since I slept here, and have to sit cross-legged on the floor in the middle of the room to avoid hitting the low-sloped ceiling with my head or arms. We insulated the walls where they leaned in above the bed, where I could listen to the rain on the tin roof above, and paneled over the insulation with smooth pale wood for an almost finished, almost intentional appearance. The end walls, though, are still only studs and fiberboard, small gaps next to the windows where I can see sunlight now and remember cold air. On these walls, Leah and I had glued pictures we cut from magazines. Hers, neatly trimmed and level, are of horses running and prairie scenes like those in books we read. Mine are cut with a less tidy hand. They're of flowers, roses mostly, and of beautiful women. The combination comforted me then and makes me smile now. I wonder if I could smuggle a saw up here, cut out the wall section and save it, frame it as a strange bit of found art, of personal history frozen behind glass. The idea makes me queasy, though, and I blush without thinking too hard about why. The room seems depressingly small instead of comfortingly cozy. I think of the insects that have likely come in through the unmended gaps, the snakes and mildew, the shreds of fiberglass insulation that are probably assaulting my lungs. Something close to panic chokes my chest, but I feel tears behind it. Unfolding my long legs and dodging around the railing in a remembered motion I didn't know I still knew. I am down the ladder and out the kitchen door in seconds. I don't stop running until I'm on the sharp downhill slope of the knob road, nearly to the level part where it turns to wind towards civilization. My car is parked there, and I'm simultaneously relieved and saddened at how nice it feels to slide into the driver's seat, to be surrounded by upholstery and plastic, by the sense of cleanliness and safety.
Good.